Trigger warning. This episode discusses political violence, executions, and childbirth complications. Viewer discretion advised. You've been crowned queen. The bells peal, banners unfurl, the court applauds. In that same bright hour, everything that was yours, your name, your body, your choices, can be written into someone else's bargain. The crown sits heavy, but it is not only weight. For many women in history, it was a trap dressed as honor, a jewel-studded sentence that turned marriage into statecraft and the bedroom into battleground. Across courts from England to Spain, from France to Castile, royal marriage was currency. Betrothals were contracts first and unions second, negotiated by men whose first concern was bloodlines and alliances, not the woman who would wear the title. Ladies-in-waiting and household staff were not only companions, they were extensions of surveillance. Childbirth was not merely private pain, but a political test. The production of an heir could secure a dynasty or mark a woman as dispensable. When things went wrong, rulings were public and swift: annulments, exile, confinement, scaffold. These were not anomalies of a few brutal men. They were instruments of a system that valued dynastic continuity above personal dignity. Imagine being 15 and told your worth hangs on a son. Imagine that your refusal, your grief, or even your very mind could be declared dangerous because it threatened a throne. These are not only tales of individual cruelty, they are structural truths that shape the lives of queens. Yet within these constraints, women found strategies to survive. They manipulated, negotiated, performed loyalty, embraced exile, feigned infirmity, or simply refused the role demanded of them. Survival often came with cost: loss of intimacy, moral compromise, isolation, but it was real, and in some cases it reshaped history. Margaret of Anjou was promised away as a girl and found herself at the center of England's bloodiest civil struggle. Married into the Lancastrian cause, she was thrust into a world where loyalty and lineage were life and death. Her husband, Henry VI, was a fragile monarch whose reign collapsed into faction and war. Contemporary chronicles record a woman who refused to fade into the background. She raised armies, negotiated with allies, and carried the grief of a lost son and a shattered court. When armies routed and exile followed, she did not accept obscurity. Records show she traveled through France and Italy, pleading for support and refusing the easy silence of defeat. She was eventually ransomed and lived the last years away from the throne, but historians agree she left a legacy of refusal to be mere ornament, refusal to surrender the political role consort and mother had thrust upon her. Her life shows how resistance could be public, loud, and personally ruinous, yet also strangely dignified.
The takeaway: when the crown was a mandate to obey, she answered with defiance. Catherine of Aragon's ordeal is a lesson in moral tenacity under legal siege. Brought to England as a Spanish princess, she fulfilled all the outward duties expected of a queen. She negotiated alliances, provided heirs, though not the son Henry demanded, and embodied Catholic piety and royal dignity. When Henry VIII sought an annulment after failing to produce a male heir, the question of her status became state business. Catherine refused to accept a legal erasure of her marriage. She insisted on the legitimacy of her vow and, above all, on her dignity as queen. She lost the legal battle. Records show the marriage was set aside and she was sidelined from court life. Yet she did not retreat into shame. In public and private, she maintained her title and title's moral claim, and by upholding her daughter's rights, she helped ensure the future path of the English crown would include a woman who would one day reshape its course. Her survival was a moral endurance that had tangible consequences, the preservation of a line, and the example that a woman's honor could be a political instrument in its own right. Not every survival was theatrical or planned. Anne of Cleves negotiated her escape with an almost accidental shrewdness. Brought to England as part of a diplomatic match, she arrived to a king who found her unattractive, and the marriage was dissolved within months. Where a failed marriage could have ended in prison or worse, Anne was granted an unusual settlement: housing, income, and the rare freedom to live apart from a king whose whims had condemned many. She kept her status as the king's sister, retained dignity and privilege, and avoided the deadly intimacy that often sealed a queen's fate. Her story complicates our assumptions about power. Sometimes survival is not heroic cunning, but fortunate avoidance, and yet even fortune can be turned into agency. The takeaway: emerging alive sometimes meant declining the thing you were supposed to accept. Catherine de' Medici began life as an Italian bride brought to France to secure an alliance. Her early position was precarious: a Florentine outsider married into a rival nobility, a mother of heirs in a court riven by faction and faith. Confronted repeatedly by threats to her children and her status, she adapted. Contemporary accounts and later historians debate the methods she used: patronage networks, intelligence gathering, ruthless decisions in moments of crisis, but few deny she turned vulnerability into strategy. She presided over a palace where loyalty was transactional and violence was a political tool. In the wake of assassinations and religious wars, she made choices that were at best morally compromised, and at worst responsible for atrocities. Yet to describe her only as monstrous is to miss the context. Those choices were often made to preserve a fragile dynasty amid religious upheaval.
Records suggest she prioritized the survival of her sons and the continuity of the Valois line, even when that meant embracing coercion that future generations would condemn. Her story forces a hard question. What does survival require when the body politic itself is tearing apart? The takeaway? Systemic violence can manufacture moral compromise. Elizabeth's answer to the crown was different by design. She turned the most intimate political bargain, marriage, into something she could decline without losing authority. Facing a court that expected a queen to marry for alliance and produce heirs, she instead cultivated an image of sovereignty that merged personal restraint with statecraft. Declaring herself married to the nation, she used performance, ceremony, and political acumen to maintain control over succession and foreign policy. The refusal to marry was not a romantic gesture, it was a deliberate political strategy. It traded the alliance benefits of a consort for a singular authority that made the monarch the nation's focal point. That choice required constant negotiation with suitors, with parliament, and with foreign powers, and it carried its own loneliness. But it worked. She emerged as a monarch whose reign defined a model of queenship rooted in singular autonomy. The takeaway? Refusal, when wielded by a ruler, can become power. Juana of Castile, known in history as Juana la Loca, may be the most contested case of all. Married to Philip the Handsome, she was a Habsburg bride whose life was upended by dynastic claims and male guardianship. After Philip's sudden death, Juana's behavior was described by contemporaries as extreme: intense grief, refusal to leave his coffin, what some called irrational mourning. But those accounts must be read against a political backdrop. Her father, later her son, had clear incentives to declare her unfit to rule. Confinement in Tordesillas effectively removed a queen who might obstruct male ambitions. Some historians argue she was suppressed for convenience, others accept elements of emotional instability. Whatever the truth of her mental state, the political outcome is clear. She was sidelined and detained, yet she never formally renounced her claim to power. In that sense, her so-called madness can be read as resistance, a refusal to cooperate with a male-dominated transfer of authority. Even in captivity, she remained a presence whose legal title complicated the ambitions of those around her. The takeaway? Apparent weakness can function as stubborn leverage in a system that equates public decorum with political availability. Mary de' Medici's life would test the endurance that monarchy demands of women. Married to Henry IV of France, she produced several children and later served as regent for the young Louis XIII after her husband's death. Her regency was marked by factional struggles and accusations of nepotism. She relied on favorites and alliances that exposed her to court resentment.
Forced from power, she experienced exile and return, manipulation and revenge, yet she retained influence until her later years. Where some queens were extinguished, Mary asserted her voice in ways that altered the course of policy and patronage. Her survival was not only bodily, it was the persistence of influence, even when formal authority evaporated. The takeaway: endurance can mean survival of voice, not just position. These 7 lives are not tidy moral lessons. They are messy, compromised, heroic, and sometimes morally culpable. What unites them is the structural reality they faced: crowns that demanded subservience, marriages arranged for dynasties, and courts that normalized surveillance and spectacle. Public executions and trials were not merely punishment, they were theater designed to instruct. When a queen fell, on the scaffold or in enforced obscurity, the performance of power continued for a watching populace. Examples set, fear instilled, factions deterred. Yet even as the system crushed, it also produced creative responses. Some queens wielded their image as armor. Some found safety in exile. Others used apparent infirmity as leverage. Some preserved dynastic lines by sheer stubbornness. Others survived by refusing intimacy or by negotiating settlements that allowed them to live. Survival was rarely pure victory. It often demanded brittle compromises and lost intimacies. But survival left traces: children who later ruled, precedents that altered expectations, reputations that reshaped what a queen might be. The intimate violence of these stories deserves careful naming. Childbirth was a crucible. Many royal women died or were weakened by repeated pregnancies because the dynasty required children above all else. The beds that bore heirs were often the same spaces in which women experienced constraint and danger.
political confinement and legal dispossession turned private grief into public advantage for others. Even the language of madness or composure was weaponized, used to justify removing a woman from power. These tactics were systemic tools, not accidents. Ask yourself, how much of modern freedom, the right to choose a partner, the legal protections against coerced confinement, the ability to assert bodily integrity, rests on centuries of historical struggle? It is easy to marvel at the spectacle of an Elizabeth or to condemn a Catherine de' Medici without seeing the larger structures that shaped their options. Their choices were carved out of restrictions that themselves deserve scrutiny. There is one more note to make about legacy. Memory is selective. Some queens are lionized, some are demonized. Later generations rewrite these lives to serve current narratives. Legends form, often mixing fact and fiction. When we read of a queen whose reported cruelty figures large, ask whose pen wrote that account and what did they gain? When we hear of apparent madness, ask who benefited from declaring her unfit?
Good historical practice disambiguates the contemporary record from later rumor. Where accounts differ, historians debate. Where anecdotes appear only in sensational retellings, treat them as legend, not fact. The crown is an emblem that both attracts and erases. For the women we have met, Margaret of Anjou, Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth I, Juana of Castile, and Mary de' Medici, to wear the crown was to enter into a set of rules that often value dynastic continuance over human dignity. Yet each of them, in her own way, pushed back. Some with sorrow, some with cunning, some with refusal. Some became architects of their own survival. Some turned suffering into political leverage. Some simply outlived the men who tried to break them. They emerged victorious not always by seizing power, but by preserving something essential, a claim to dignity, a lineage, an authority, or a story that could not be fully extinguished. If this history is revealing, like and subscribe to keep these stories alive. These women's lives should not be romanticized as simple heroism. They show the human cost of monarchical systems that treated women as instruments of policy. Yet they also show the capacity for resistance where none should have been possible. Their survival, with all its moral ambiguity, reshaped courts, influenced laws, and altered succession in ways that still ripple through history. The private cost was immense: exile, confinement, grief, the loss of children, and the erosion of personal freedom. The public payoffs, dynastic continuity, political stability, or new models of rule remind us how tightly woven the personal and political were. Today, many freedoms that would have been unimaginable to these queens are enshrined in law and custom: the right to consent, legal protection from arbitrary confinement, and the increasingly recognized equality of marriage. That does not mean that gendered control has vanished. It means that some of the bluntest instruments of power have been blunted. For that, we can be soberly grateful while refusing to forget what it cost to arrive here. History asks something of us beyond fascination. It asks empathy and vigilance. Empathy for those who lived under cruel constraints, vigilance about the structures that still shape lives. The crown need not be a trap today, but the patterns that made it one in the past, surveillance, commodification of bodies, legal structures that subordinate the personal to state aims, can reappear in new forms. Remembering these 7 queens is not only a matter of admiring resilience, it is a warning about what systems can demand and what courage it takes to answer. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's forgotten survivors, and share this with someone who should know the price many paid to shape the worlds we live in now.